Hi, I'm attorney Gregory Dell here with attorney Stephen Jessup, and today we're going to do an occupation video for long-term disability claims, specifically dealing with the occupational field of engineers. Now, Steve, you know when I say engineers there's a lot of engineers. It's a major in college that I know when I was in college at Washington University in St. Louis. It was harder than med school. It was known as the hardest major, so it's a very demanding occupation, and it's very broad, whether you're chemical, aerospace, construction, mechanical. There's tons of different engineers, and we've represented all the different types of engineers. But from a long-term disability standpoint, what's the primary concern in terms of occupational classification that comes to your mind when you're representing an engineer?
I mean, I think the biggest thing is how the insurance company is going to look at the physical component of it, in two ways. One, are they going to, say for instance, construction engineering, aerospace engineering, where you may be moving and dealing with large objects and you're on sites, you're doing things like that, this idea of physical aspect. Are they going to try to say that the job is a sedentary job, so you just have to sit at a desk all day? So from a physical component, are they paying attention to what those physical demands of your specific area of engineering are? And then on the flip side of that, right? So, this is a job that can have quite a bit of physical component to it beyond sedentary desk work. But are they also properly looking at the cognitive component? You might be able to do physical work, but can you cognitively do the demands, those mental demands of the job? So it's making sure that they are taking into account what you have to do physically, for your particular field of engineering. But second, that they're also taking a look at beyond that, what those mental demands, the memory, the cognitive function, the higher executive functioning stuff. It is an occupation that can really work both sides. Us as attorneys, it's a sedentary occupation, so more often we're just going to look at what the cognitive demands are. But in engineering, you do have this nexus and this interplay between physical and mental demands that in some areas of engineering can be quite high at both levels.
How would an engineer, what should an engineer expect as to how they would prove their occupation to the disability insurance company?
It's interesting because this isn't something necessarily where, you have codes or you do this stuff. And then more often than not, on a disability carrier, it's going to be the job description. Your employer's job description is going to explain what you do. Also, the employer itself, what field you're in. I mean, if you're working for Boeing, there stands a good chance of the nature of the engineering could be aerospace derived. So it's also going to be related to the field, the company. You work for DuPont, chemical engineer, things like that. But the job description is basically going to govern how any insurance company is going to initially look at your case. And in some instances, it'll be the only way that they'll look at occupational aspects of your job.
Now, the job description we often always get, but what we find a lot is that the job description doesn't accurately reflect what the employee is actually doing. How do you deal with that?
I mean, if in situations where, as long as it's not something from a privacy or work product type situation that they can't, it's easy if your client's working on certain types of projects and stuff, if they can give samples of the work that they've done to show what it is. It's almost the same idea of a doctor being able to show you surgical codes and say, I do these surgeries. So if there's samples of the work that they do in product in there, to be able to present to an insurance company. Sometimes, though, there's copyright issues that they can't, privacy, whatever the case may be. So it's really kind of a case by case and how the insurance company may be looking at it. Obviously, they have the incentive, and the insurance company, to try to downplay what your job duties are to the lowest common denominator, whether it be physically or mentally. So you have to be prepared in realizing that they're not going to take anything you necessarily say at face value. There's going to have to be stuff to document it back, whether the employer will write a letter explaining what projects they worked on, what type of work, things like that. Because those blank job descriptions, you read it, and for any occupation, like, okay, and there's always some caveat at the end, and other duties not otherwise specified. Well, that's generally what the person is doing most of the time. And a lot of the other stuff seems to be, at times fluff interplay as to generalized duties.
Yeah, and a lot of the engineers we represented have been at the company for 10, 15 years, and they might have had some job description when they started the job, and their job looks nothing like that. And what happens in the back end is the employer sends in this job description to the company, and it's not an accurate reflection of what's going on. So you brought up some great points about getting a letter from the employer, putting in samples of your work product. Some other things I do is getting letters from other coworkers. Possibly if you're somebody who has clients that you're working for as an engineer, getting some letters from them discussing the type of work that had to have been done. And some may find that's intrusive, but when you're at the point that you're really struggling and you probably won't be able to get back to work, it's not as intrusive to discuss that with a client. And usually your clients are going to know something's going on because they've seen and you've told them, look, I can't do what I used to do for you. Here's why. And when I feel like I can, I hope to get back, but I may need your help. That's not a first step out of the box, but it's another tool that can come. The bigger challenge I think we see for engineers is that a lot of the engineers don't buy their own disability policies. They have a group policy provided by their employer. And they often have a definition of disability that says you're unable to do the duties of your occupation, but it's how your occupation's performed in the national economy. And if you can talk a minute about how you could have two people that have the same job title in the national economy, but one requires sedentary primarily type work and the other one is medium to heavy duty work. And the person who is doing medium to heavy duty work, whereas the national economy standard is a sedentary type occupation, what is the person with the medium to heavy duty supposed to do in that situation?
Yeah, that's where it can get difficult, and that's where it's important to be prepared early on with that and the issues that may arise from that. Because the national economy standards is just this idea of your occupation is not how you perform it for your employer at your specific location, but how it's generally performed in the economy throughout the country. A lot of times they'll go back to the Department of Labor's Dictionary of Occupational Titles and just look up the title that corresponds with your job. And engineering does have a lot of offshoots, but it's also dated. The Dictionary of Occupational Titles has been around for a long time. And a lot of these new areas, especially in computer engineering and sciences like that, aren't necessarily properly represented there. So they may try to pigeonhole you into something that isn't correct. I've even found that when you have a hard time finding a generalized, all-encompassing generic job description, I mean, sometimes looking at other resources online like these, application websites and, job hiring websites where they have things about what the duties would be performed, and then again, going into this idea of what type of engineering do you do? That's really going to be one of the hallmarks. There are engineers that have to be on construction sites. They're involved in all these types of things. They have to travel to sites. So making sure that's being represented properly, and like you said too, getting information from the employer so that any type of clients that you're on the site, the job sites with, and establishing that, because the generic dictionary of occupational titles, that really isn't an end-all be-all. You can find a sample of the same type of job in different markets throughout the country and be able to draw a nexus and show that there's a lot of commonality in this specific type of engineering. And you can't take a look at just a sedentary, I'm in the, sitting at my desk all day, at a computer. So you have to sometimes be creative when the job description isn't accurate, or like you had said, someone's with a company for years and years and years. I'm sure you've had it, I've had it, where the employer never technically updated the job description in their system. So if an insurance company says, hey, we need a job description for this client, they just look through, HR looks through, oh, this is the one we have on file, and that could have been the job they were doing a decade ago. So you want to make sure everything's as up to date and time relevant. How a job was performed 10 years ago isn't necessarily how it's going to be performed nowadays. So in a situation with engineering, since it's such a broad category of different types of jobs, you sometimes have to be very creative in showing what this national economy standard is for the specific type of engineering that you may be performing.
Another tip that I want to throw out there for engineers is this concept that most of the people filing for long-term disability are filing due to a chronic medical condition. They've been dealing with whatever the medical condition is for several months or years, and they've tried to work through it. And they have the opportunity, and a lot of people don't know, to possibly cut back on the work and try to make an accommodation. And that's what's known as a partial or residual disability provision. And usually in most policies, as long as you have a 20 or 25% loss of income, then you can become eligible for disability, continue to earn, this reduced income at work, and continue to get a certain portion of income from the disability carrier. The advantage to that is that you don't get stuck with this argument that the disability carrier loves to throw at someone to say, well, you had this condition for 2 or 3 years and you worked through it. Why all of a sudden now are you stopping work? So it's like you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, but at least you have the opportunity to say, well, I tried to cut back. Instead of just going cold turkey without necessarily a reduction in my work, I'm cutting back a little bit. And I'm going to try to do that for a few months. And if that goes for a few months and you still can't do it, it's an easier claim to present by cutting back rather than, just stopping work altogether. Now, it sounds good in practicality when you and I talk about it here and throw it out there, but a lot of employers may say, look, I can't accommodate you for 20, 25 hours or 30 hours. I need you here 40 to 50 hours that you've been here. So that solution may not work for everybody. And if it doesn't work, it still doesn't mean you can't be total because you're willing to try. But I wanted to throw it out as a tip, as an option, that it's in a lot of the policies from the largest disability carriers that you can try this scenario of cutting back. Along those lines, the person that's chronically having difficulties, a lot of people don't like to go to the doctor. Plain and simple. They, yeah, my back's bothering. Yes, my neck's bothering. Yes, I'm in front of the computer a lot. Yes, I get headaches. What's the doctor going to do for me? I had an MRI or an X-ray 5 years ago. I know what it is. But then all of a sudden it gets really bad and they stop. How important is the medical treatment and the medical support for an engineer to get disability approved?
It's everything. It really is everything. What you had said, the vast majority of these are employer provided policies. And if you extrapolate out into potential filing of a lawsuit to try to get benefits if you have to, the only thing that's going to be considered is documentation. So medical documentation is so very important. Yeah, you may have had an X-ray or an MRI 5 years ago. An insurance company is not going to necessarily care about that because you continue to work. So obviously it wasn't impairing. So if you don't have contemporaneous medical information to support why you're stopping now or why things have gotten worse, the insurance company is going to eat you alive with that. They may argue the time you filed for disability, there was no information to support that you would have restrictions and limitations. And you may be getting medical testing done months and months later, but you really need stuff prior to going out. Now, it can be hard getting into specialists and whatnot, but if you're having a problem, then you think it may be impacting your ability to work, you have to take the time at the very least to get into a primary care doctor, start getting things documented, get a referral out to whatever specialist you may need, because the insurance company, they'll talk to you, they'll have you fill out forms, hear your side of the story, but everything is going to ultimately fall back on what do your medical records show. And if you aren't getting to the doctor and there's not updated contemporaneous information, you're really going to have a very hard time getting the claim approved.
Right.
Barring some like catastrophic injury of some sort, where there's a delineating like, oh, something happened, this is why we're talking about, like you said, that chronic medical condition that you've had that bad back for years.
Right, and every single disability insurance company has their own definition of disability, their own definition of what your occupation is. They all have their own methodologies and claims handling processes, and they're all different. And fortunately, we've produced videos on just about every aspect for every disability insurance company. So if you're someone who's applying or you've been denied, we have appeal videos, lawsuit videos, videos on how to help you apply. So we encourage you to go to our website at diattorney.com, take a look at the insurance company section, search up your company, and you're going to find tons of information there with tons of articles and additional tips so that you can really be knowledgeable about how to handle your claim outside of just your engineering occupation. And the most important thing is reach out to any of our lawyers, Stephen, myself. We're available nationwide to represent you. We're always going to provide you with initial free consultation. And if you don't need us now, you should consider subscribing to our YouTube channel because we're putting out new videos every week with information that we hope you will find helpful. We appreciate you taking the time to watch this video.